Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 122, William of Stratford, Part 4. With mirth and laughter, let old wrinkles come. Last time, I took the biography of Shakespeare up to the formation of the playing troupe for whom he would write all of his major plays, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, and on to his early success as a playwright in London. So without further ado, I'll now complete the biography of William of Stratford, from where he reaches the pinnacle of success through to his death after years of retirement. Shakespeare's rise as part of the Lord Chamberlain's Men is found in a few of the records that we have. He is mentioned as an actor in the company for the 1594 Christmas celebrations at court that I mentioned last time. That document lists him in the same breath as Will Kemp, who was already well known and the acknowledged successor of Tarleton, suggesting that Shakespeare was also a leading player for the company. Apart from traditions that I've already mentioned before, we know nothing else about Shakespeare's acting career, but as an actor, the leading writer for the company and a sharer, it's surely Shakespeare's DNA that runs through the Lord Chamberlain's Men. He was not a jobbing playwright in the sense of a Green or a Decker, scraping a living where he could, but, it would seem, a man invested in that particular group of players and their performances of, in many cases, his own plays. Again, we don't know for sure, but it seems unthinkable that Shakespeare wouldn't have been involved in the original staging of the plays, and that the principal players of the company would not also have made their own contribution to the development of the plays in rehearsal. On the 28th of December 1594, the Comedy of Errors was performed at Gray's Inn as part of their Christmas celebrations. Although the record is not explicit, it seems likely that it was the Chamberlain's Men who were performing Shakespeare's play. This was the first Christmas after a serious visitation of the plague, and evidently the audience of young gentry engaged in their studies for the bar were more than over-enthusiastic about the party season. A description from the Gesta Grayorum, a published account of the entertainments held at Gray's Inn that Christmas, reports how the ambassador for the inner temple came about 9 o'clock at night, when the ambassador was placed, and there was something to be performed for the delight of the beholders. There arose such a disordered tumult and crowd upon the stage that there was no opportunity to effect that which was intended. The Lord Ambassador and his train thought that they were not so kindly entertained as was before expected, and thereupon would not stay any longer. After their departure, the throngs and the tumults did somewhat subside, although so much of them continued as was able to disorder and confound any good inventions whatsoever. In regard whereof, as also for that the sports intended were especially for the gracing of the Templarians, it was thought good not to offer anything of account saving dancing and revelling with gentlewomen, and after such sports, a comedy of errors, like Plautus his Menachmus, was played by the players. So that night was begun and continued to the end in nothing but confusion and errors, whereupon it was ever afterwards called the Night of Errors. It is noticeable, particularly in early Shakespeare plays, how often references are made to the legal profession, and how much legal language is used, suggesting an influence from the Inns of Court, which remained a source of income for the players and, next to the public playhouses, perhaps the second most popular place in London for players to be seen. Players were also known to attend special occasions and make special performances for them. A Midsummer Night's Dream, it has been suggested, was created for a wedding celebration. In this case, the size of the cast would certainly have meant that the Chamberlain's Men would have had to recruit additional players for the performance. The Merry Wives of Windsor is likely to have been written for the ceremony where Lord Hudson, the Lord Chamberlain himself, was made Knight of the Garter, a ceremony that took place in Windsor Castle, as it still does today. I'll look further at the possible settings for the original production of these plays when we get to discuss them in detail. I've already mentioned in previous episodes author Francis Mears, who in 1598 produced a work that included commentary on Shakespeare, proving positive but not completely accurate dating for the early plays. But it is such an important comment on the history of Shakespeare that I'll mention it again here. The quote goes, As Plautus and Seneca are accounted the best for comedy and tragedy among the Latins, so Shakespeare among the English is the most excellent in both kinds for the stage. For comedy, witness his Gentleman of Verona, his Errors, his Love's Labours Lost, his Love's Labours Won, his Midsummer Night's Dream, and his Merchant of Venice. For tragedy, his Richard II, Richard III, Henry IV, King John, Titus Andronicus, and his Romeo and Juliet. But in addition to this, he praises Shakespeare for his mightily enriching the English language, rare ornaments and resplendent habiliments. He says that Shakespeare is one of the most passionate among us to bewail and bemoan the perplexities of love, and that he is the mellifluous and honey-tongued poet and creator of fine-filed phrases. Of course, what catches the ear now most, along with the conflation of tragedies and history plays, is the inclusion of Love's Labours Won. Many assumed this to be a mistake by Mears, but that seems unlikely since the discovery of a scrap of manuscript where Love's Labours Won is included in a stock list from a bookshop that is dated to August 1603. One suggestion is that this was an alternative title for The Taming of the Shrew, despite the fact that this play has its own entry in the same listing. Much Ado About Nothing and All's Well That Ends Well have also been suggested as candidates for what would otherwise be a lost play about which we have no other mention. From this early period, we have some more evidence of Shakespeare in the London theatre world, and it's one of the few times where William is involved in a legal matter. In autumn 1596, William White petitioned for sureties of the peace against William Shakespeare, Francis Langley, Dorothy Sower, wife of John Sower, and Annie Lee, for fear of death. The for fear of death is a legal form rather than a literal concern, but still it sounds like William was involved in something pretty serious. To obtain this action, White had sworn before a judge that he was in fear of bodily harm. Those named would then be brought before the sheriff and would have had to have posted a bond on pain of breaching the peace. Of Francis Langley, who ran the Swan Playhouse, we have heard before. If you go back to episode 96, Thomas Nash, satirist, pamphleteer and playwright, you will hear the story of how Langley was involved in staging The Isle of Dogs at the Swan. The play by Johnson and Nash caused the closure of the London theatres that summer thanks to its inflammatory content. William White turns up in the records making several complaints against various people at different times, and seems to have been something of a loose cannon. He was also involved in a previous case with Langley when local Justice of the Peace William Gardner attempted to close the Swan. We don't know how Shakespeare had become drawn into this matter in 1596 that caused White to have so much concern for his personal safety, but it has been suggested that some of the characters involved in it are reflected in The Merry Wives of Windsor. Following these early successes with the Henry VI plays and several comedies for both Shakespeare and the Lord Chamberlain's men, some tougher times were around the corner. The owner of the land on which the theatre stood, Giles Allen, was of a Puritan leaning and had never much liked the fact that a theatre stood on his land. As the lease came up for renewal, James Burbage and Allen had been in protracted negotiations over the rent for the land. You can hear all about that story in episode 89, Building Theatre, the earliest playhouses in London. In January 1597, James Burbage died, and his two sons inherited the lease for the theatre. In July that year, the aforementioned Isle of Dogs was produced at the Swan, and the London theatres were closed for the summer, but not pulled down, as was threatened in the Privy Council's initial response to that play. With the resumption of theatre, the Lord Chamberlain's men moved to the Curtain, seemingly feeling that their time at the theatre was over. The company still had a reliable patron, but no permanent home. Cuthbert Burbage took over negotiations with Allen in the autumn of 1598, and agreed to the exorbitant rent that Allen was now demanding. But Allen refused to accept Cuthbert's brother Richard as a guarantor, perhaps reflecting the untrustworthiness in which the playing profession was usually held. And Allen stated that he planned to pull down the theatre and put the timber to better use. For the full story of how the theatre was indeed torn down, but then converted into the Globe, you can return to episode 104, part 2 of the story of the London playhouses. But to cut to the quick here, on the 28th of December 1598, the players and carpenter Peter Street took the theatre down, spar by spar and plank by plank, and carried it away to be stored and used in building the Globe the following spring, when the ground in Bankside had thawed out and the foundations could be dug. The Chamberlain's men then had a new permanent home right next to their main rivals, the Admiral's men, at the Rose Theatre, and the other entertainments of Elizabethan London. There is some speculation about which play opened the Globe, some saying Henry V, because of its notable opening prologue, is most likely. The first properly recorded performance was Julius Caesar, when on the 21st of September, Thomas Platter, a visitor from Basel, Switzerland, recorded that, "After dinner, about 2 o'clock, I went with my party across the water. In the straw-thatched house we saw the tragedy of the first emperor Julius Caesar very pleasingly performed, with approximately 15 characters. At the end of the play they danced together admirably and exceedingly gracefully, according to their custom, 2 in each group dressed in men's and 2 in women's apparel." Which is a lovely piece of documentary evidence, but also the proof that, even after a serious tragedy, the players took to the traditional jig to end the performance, which might seem more than a little incongruous to us now. It's with the building of the Globe that we get a real sense of Shakespeare embedded into the Lord Chamberlain's men. The agreement they drew up to fund the move was between 3 groups: Nicholas Brend, the lessee, Cuthbert and Richard Burbage, and 5 members of the Chamberlain's men: William Shakespeare, John Hemmings, Augustine Phillips, Thomas Pope, and William Kemp. These 5 men held half of the lease, with the Burbage brothers taking the other half, so Shakespeare held a 1/2 of a 1/5 interest in the Globe enterprise, so 10% of the whole. When Will Kemp left the company in 1602, Shakespeare and the others increased their holdings to a 1/8 share of the total, and this was then reduced to a 1/12 share when the players Henry Condell and William Sly became shareholders sometime before 1610. The shares were further reduced to a 1/14 share after William Osler joined in 1612. The benefit of the shares fluctuated with the fortunes of the theatre, but it is these shares, and those that he also held in the Blackfriars Theatre, that made Shakespeare and his fellow sharers wealthy men. By the late 1590s, Shakespeare was resident in London. We know that for a while he lodged with a French immigrant family in Silver Street in London, the Mountjoys in the anglicised version of their name, and their trade was tyre making. Tyre makers produced accoutrements for hats and caps and any form of head attire, which in some cases also meant they worked as hairdressers, but also that they produced the decorations for the head that are often seen in portraits of Elizabethan and Jacobean ladies, including queens. Silver Street no longer exists, but was located in the north of the city, so a little away from the theatre in the Blackfriars and quite a distance from Bankside. We don't know why Shakespeare moved there, but perhaps being away from the distractions over the river was a good thing for a playwright, and it was certainly a little more upmarket and quieter, being an area populated by craftsmen and merchants, many of whom, like the Mountjoys, were foreigners who had come to London, be it through persecution or economic choice, but were now making the best of things there. In May 1612, Shakespeare gave evidence in a lawsuit at the Court of Requests in Westminster. It's one of the documents from which we get Shakespeare's signature, of which there are only 6 extant examples. By then he was 48 years old and a very successful playwright and theatre sharer. But the case in which he was required to give evidence related to an earlier period in his life during his residency in Silver Street. The dispute was between Christopher Mountjoy and his former apprentice and his son-in-law, Stephen Bellott. Stephen alleged that when he married Christopher's daughter, he had been promised a dowry of £60, this in 1604, but it had never been paid. In addition, he alleged that Christopher had promised to leave the couple a legacy of £200 when he died. Shakespeare was called as a witness, as he could speak to the situation in the household at the time. His statement is rather perfunctory and may not have been that much help. He states that he knew both men for about 10 years and remembers the apprentice as a very good and industrious servant who did honestly behave himself. He confirms that a dowry was promised, although he can't remember the sum nor the quantity or type of household goods that were also part of the marriage arrangement. Interestingly, he says he was asked by Marie Mountjoy, Christopher's wife and the bride's mother, to speak to Belot and persuade him to go through with the marriage. His words are reported by the clerk of the court as follows. This deponent saith that the said defendant's wife did solicit and entreat this deponent to move and persuade the said complainant to effect the said marriage, and accordingly this deponent did move and persuade the complainant thereto. In fact, another witness in the same case says that the couple were made sure by Mr. Shakespeare, and says that they giving each other's hand to the hand. Now that suggests that Shakespeare may have had a role in performing the troth-plighting or hand-fasting ceremony that would have effectively bound the couple together. Perhaps, despite the bland language of the court, we get a small insight into William's life and his role as more than a lodger, but a trusted friend, a person who could help a family with its interpersonal issues. Otherwise, the court case is rather bland and gives no further clue to Shakespeare's role in the house other than that of a lodger. A maidservant, in her evidence, speaks of one Mr. Shakespeare that lay in the house, meaning without doubt that he was staying there. Although it's not possible to be precise about the timing based on these documents, it would seem that Shakespeare was lodging in Silver Street by 1602. Prior to this, we only have records of Shakespeare's earliest time in London, the taxation records from Bishopsgate and Southwark that I mentioned last time. So there are quite a few years where we can't say for sure where Shakespeare was living. Throughout these years spent in London, it is assumed that Shakespeare returned to Stratford at regular intervals. He purchased a large house there, New Place, in 1597 and maintained business interests and land purchases that have been traced. But there is no documentary evidence of specific visits there, not even for the time when he must have returned to Stratford on the 11th of August 1596, the day his son Hamnet was buried. Hamnet was 11 years and 6 months old. It isn't possible to imagine what effect that might have had on Shakespeare and the rest of the family, and whether or not it affected his decisions about how often to return to his hometown or not. But the purchase of New Place indicates that he, to some extent at least, still saw Stratford as home. The history of New Place has been much investigated, and its previous owners identified and examined, and it seems likely that the house was in a poor state of repair when Shakespeare acquired it, and that he would have undertaken many improvements and repairs to bring it up to modern standards. In 1598, the town corporation is recorded as paying Mr. Shakespeare 10 pence for a load of stone, which was used to mend Clopton Bridge. Although the circumstances of this deal are not entirely clear, it seems likely that Shakespeare was selling off stone left over from the renovation of New Place. And now there is a sense of time moving on. In Stratford on the 8th of September 1601, John Shakespeare was buried in the churchyard of the Holy Trinity Church. The extended family was no doubt living in New Place by then, but the family dynamic changes with William now at its head. John's wife Mary died 7 years later in September 1608, but life as it does went on, with William presumably travelling between London and Stratford, and Anne running the large house in his absence. Just a few records of Shakespeare's dealings in the Stratford area survive. They comprise some legal records, such as a case where Shakespeare sued a neighbour in Stratford in 1604 for repayment of a small loan, and a more lengthy legal entanglement with another Stratford local that started in 1608, again over some monetary matters. In an age before bank credit was easily available to individuals, it was common for wealthy and not even quite so wealthy men to lend friends, acquaintances and business associates money. Shakespeare was hardly unusual in this, nor in resorting to the law for satisfaction where necessary. The Elizabethans were quite a litigious lot. There was also land purchases, both in Stratford town and in the surrounding farmland, all of which would indicate a significant interest in the town and, we have to assume, regular visits there. His biggest recorded investment was in July 1605, when he paid £440 for a one-half interest in a lease of tithes of corn, grain, bale and hay in the nearby villages of Old Stratford, Welcombe and Bishopton. Perhaps these sizable investments were provision for a planned retirement, or simply a recognition of the uncertainties of earning a living in the theatre. By 1605, the Shakespeares could again be considered a wealthy family, and presumably there was some relief that his father's problems, whatever they were exactly, were put behind them. And perhaps we should not underestimate the importance that Shakespeare would have attached to leaving a legacy for the family, even though there was now no male line to carry the Shakespeare name. Back in London, Shakespeare's career as a playwright had gone from strength to strength. But even he and his fellow players must have been concerned by the changing times. In February 1603, they played for the Queen for what would be the last time. She died at the end of March, and her cousin, James VI of Scotland, was proclaimed her successor as James I of England. In many ways, it was a relatively smooth transition of power for the times, but the players might have been more concerned than many. The new king was a Protestant, the primary reason Elizabeth named him as her successor, but there was no guarantee that he would be a lover of theatre, and it would only take a small change of mood for the player's life to become very much harder than it had been under Elizabeth. The Lord Chamberlain's men must have been very relieved when only 10 days after the king's arrival in London, James instructed his principal counsellor, Lord Cecil, to prepare for the company letters patent under the Great Seal of England. The royal warrant, dated the 17th of May 1603, states, "These our servants, Lawrence Fletcher, William Shakespeare, Richard Burbage, Augustine Phillips, John Hemmings, Henry Condell, William Sly, Robert Armin, Richard Cowley, and the rest of their associates, freely to use and exercise the art and faculty of playing comedies, tragedies, histories, interludes, morals, pastorals, stage plays, and such others like they have already studied or hereafter shall use or study, as well for the recreation of our loving subjects as for our solace and pleasure, when we shall think good to see them during our pleasure." The warrant goes on to state that whenever the players were publicly exercising their quality within their now usual home called the Globe, or in any city, university town, or borough of the realm, that all justices, mayors, other officers, and loving subjects to allow them such former courtesies as has been given to men of their place and quality, and also what further favour you shall show to those our servants for our sake, for such favour we shall take kindly at your hands. The patent was then renewed in 1619, and again after the king had died in 1625, and made the King's Men, as they would now be known, undoubtedly the preeminent company in the country. The other playing companies were also given licences to perform, but under the patronage of more junior members of the royal family, so that the Admiral's men became Prince Henry's men, and the Earl of Worcester's men became Queen Anne's men. So a happy day for the King's Men, but the entry of the King into London was delayed by another occurrence of the plague. When the King was crowned in July 1603, there was no procession, and the public was banned from the ceremony. A very belated procession did take place through London in March 1604, for which the King's Men were granted 4.5 yards of scarlet red cloth for their livery, as they were technically grooms of the chamber, and therefore members of the King's household. It was soon discovered that the new King was indeed a lover of theatre, and no players played more for him than the King's Men. It has been calculated that they played 187 times in his presence, from his accession until Shakespeare's death. In the year from November 1604, the Master of the Revels records that they played 11 performances, 7 of which were revivals of plays by Shakespeare. Although the records from the Elizabethan era are sketchy, this does suggest that they played on average once a month for the king, rather than the 3 times a year that they played for his predecessor. In those first years of the 17th century, they were able to present Othello, Macbeth, Antony and Cleopatra, and King Lear, for the king's pleasure, and in addition to Shakespeare's work, they also performed Volpone and The Alchemist, two of Ben Jonson's very best plays. Shakespeare's friendly rivalry with Ben Jonson has been much discussed over the years, and it would be remiss of me not to mention it here, as Jonson is famously known for both criticising but ultimately praising Shakespeare. But I think perhaps it is such a complex matter that it deserves an episode of all of its own. For the moment, it's probably worth noting that Shakespeare was godfather to one of Jonson's children, and although they undoubtedly did fall out at times, Jonson's final praise of Shakespeare is perhaps the more meaningful for all that. In August 1608, the King's men took on the lease of the Blackfriars Theatre. This disused monastery had previously been chosen by James Burbage for an indoor theatre, but the scheme was abandoned once the local residents objected. You can hear more about that in episode 103, where I tell the story of the London playhouses. The players were active there by autumn 1609, having a permanent winter home for the first time. It was a more intimate theatre than the Globe, perhaps fitting 700 into the audience space, so something less than a quarter of the size of the Globe. But the audience no doubt appreciated the galleries and the seats, although for the privilege they did have to pay a higher price of 6p to enter. Some scholars suggest that it was the move to the Blackfriars that led Shakespeare to write some of his more thoughtful and intimate later plays. Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale, and possibly The Tempest may have been written with this space in mind. But they were performed in both houses, and there is actually no suggestion that the more sophisticated audience at the Blackfriars appreciated the complex plays any more or less than the groundlings at the Globe. There was, as well, adaptation, no doubt, for provincial touring that still continued, where staging had to be accommodated to fit whatever space was available. In what would turn out to be towards the end of his career, Shakespeare paid £80 to buy a house near Blackfriars Theatre, this in March 1613. The site also had easy access to ferry boats on the river for the journey to Bankside and the Globe. Richard Burbage had also bought property in that area, so it might be that Shakespeare was following his friend's investment advice when he purchased the property. But whatever the case, it certainly does not suggest that he was intending to leave London any time soon. And Shakespeare undoubtedly had money to invest. In late 1613, the King's men provided entertainment at the wedding of the King's daughter Princess Elizabeth to Prince Frederick, the Elector Palatine of the Rhine. They entertained the royal company over 3 days of celebrations with no fewer than 14 plays, including Much Ado About Nothing, The Winter's Tale, Othello and The Tempest, for which they were paid the enormous sum of £93. It is also possible that Shakespeare wrote Henry VIII for these wedding celebrations. Although it's not specifically mentioned in the court accounts, there is one unnamed play that was due to be performed on the 16th of February, but was cancelled for unknown reasons and replaced with a masque. There are also records of fees paid to Shakespeare for much smaller, bespoke work, such as a motto he wrote for the Earl of Rutland to be worn as part of his retainer's costume during competitions held at court. For these few lines, he was paid 44 shillings. By this time, Shakespeare was often writing with collaborators, probably with John Fletcher for Henry VIII and George Wilkins for Pericles. Wilkins seems a particularly strange partner, who will get some more airtime when we get to Pericles. But perhaps this suggests that Shakespeare was beginning to feel that he wasn't competing well with the young rising playwrights, who were writing the in-vogue city comedies, of a much more bawdier nature than we ever find in Shakespeare. Whatever the case, it appears that things were brought to an end on the 29th of June, 1613. The following account of what happened was written 3 days after the events by Sir Henry Wotton in a letter to his nephew, although Wotton himself wasn't present at the Globe that afternoon. The King's Players had a new play called All is True, representing some principal pieces of the reign of Henry VIII, which were set forth with much extraordinary circumstance of pomp and majesty, even to the matting on the stage, the knights of the order with their Georges and garters, the guards with their embroidered coats, and the like. Sufficient in truth, within a while, to make greatness very familiar, if not ridiculous. Now, King Henry making a masque at the Cardinal Wolsey's house, and certain chambers being shot off at his entry, some of the papers or other stuff, wherein one of them was stopped, did light on the thatch, where being thought at first but an idle smoke, and their eyes more attentive on the show, it kindled inwardly, and ran along like a train, consuming within less than an hour the whole house to the very grounds. It was the fatal period of that virtuous fabric, wherein yet nothing did perish but wood and straw, and a few forsaken cloaks. Only one man had his breeches set on fire, and would perhaps have broiled himself, if he had not, by the benefit of a provident wit, put it out with a bottle of ale. The certain chambers there were cannons used for sound effects, housed within the roof space of the globe. Once the thatch had caught, a strong summer wind could easily have sent the roof up in just a matter of minutes, with a wooden frame catching soon after. The globe was burned to the ground, which for centuries has now been seen as the end of an era. Although those of a religious mindset saw God's will in these events, the players picked themselves up, mourned the loss of their scripts and their props and their costumes, and then began the process of rebuilding. By June the next year, the new globe had risen from the ashes of the old, this time with a tiled roof. The rebuilding costs were the responsibility of the sharers, and we know that at least one, John Witter, who had acquired his shares by marrying the widow of Augustine Phillips, could not afford his contribution and gave them up. But we don't know what Shakespeare did with his, or indeed if he ever returned to London again. Of Shakespeare's last years spent in Stratford, we know very little. He probably co-wrote The Two Noble Kinsmen in 1613 with John Fletcher, and he was still involved in some London matters as late as 1615, relating to his properties in the capital. Although it isn't clear that he ever visited London again, we have to assume that this was very likely from time to time. His name appears on a 1611 petition issued by the Stratford Town Council to request funds from the government to repair the highway, a road that he, of course, often travelled. Later the same year, a neighbour died, and the lease of a barn belonging to Mr. Shakespeare is mentioned in the post-mortem inventory. Mostly, we assume a peaceful and uneventful retirement at New Place in Stratford. Shakespeare's brother Gilbert died in February 1612, and almost exactly a year later, his younger brother Richard also passed away. Shakespeare's passing on the 23rd of April 1616 is recorded in the parish register 2 days later, where he was buried simply with the words, "Will Shakespeare, Gent." The circumstances of his death are not known for sure, but a story that emerged 50 years after the events came from John Ward, Stratford vicar and physician, who noted that Shakespeare, his printer and friend Michael Drayton, and Ben Jonson had a merry meeting, and it seems drunk too hard, for Shakespeare died of a fever there contracted. With Ben Jonson present, it's not hard to believe that there was indeed some hard drinking that evening. Earlier that year, Shakespeare had drawn up his will, so perhaps he had a sense that his time was near. The final amendments were made in late March 1616, at which point he described himself as in perfect health and memory. But this is a formula often used in wills and can't be taken as a reasonable assessment of his state of health. What we can see, though, is that the now famous signature is rather weak, and forming it seems to have taken a very great deal of effort. When Augustine Phillips, Shakespeare's fellow actor and founder member of the Lord Chamberlain's men, died in 1605, he left gifts in his will to his fellow sharers and many others who filled more junior roles in the company. At the very top of this list was Shakespeare's name. Item: I give and bequeath to my fellow William Shakespeare a 30-shilling piece of gold. He was this generous only to Shakespeare and Condell. It is notable that apart from Robert Greene's snide comments, nobody seems to have a bad word about Shakespeare, and he remained aloof from the trials and tribulations of the London life that many of his other fellow playwrights were caught up in. It is quite unusual amongst brilliant creatives, where some degree of ego must be encountered, and especially those who run a company where a sharp nose for the financial edge would be required, for there to be next to no bad feeling on display. Perhaps Shakespeare was so devoted to his art that he did nothing but write plays, manage his business back home, and run the Globe Theatre with his fellow sharers. Perhaps he was incredibly shy and kept himself to himself, and didn't take advantage of the things that London had to offer. Perhaps, outside the pages of his plays, he was a rather boring man. Perhaps he did revisit Stratford frequently, and was only resident in London for so long because it was the only place to be successful in the theatre. We will never know for sure. Next time I'll be moving on from biography to the plays, and we start with one of the earliest plays, Henry VI, Part 1. In the meantime, please join the Facebook page or group, or find the podcast on Instagram or X to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. If you do feel able to help out with the cost of running the podcast, then please head over to Patreon, where you will find additional content for a small monthly fee or a one-off donation. New episodes there are continuing with the story of criticism of Shakespeare in the 18th century, but you also get immediate access to all of the back episodes too. You can find details of ways to support the podcast at the website, which is www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com. I look forward to your company next time, but if you do have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or via X at thoetp.